5 minutes, seriously, 5 minutes after the moving truck pulled away, 3 people from the Crestview Shores HOA board marched onto my dock, demanding I tear it down immediately. What they didn't know, what they absolutely had no clue about, was that every boat slip they could see, every dock they were standing on, and the entire commercial waterfront behind them, all belonged to me, the woman leading the charge. A person I would come to know as Cynthia Vance was about to learn she'd made the biggest, most expensive mistake of her life, and honestly, watching her face when the full truth came out was worth every single penny of the headache she was about to cause me. But before I dive into the chaos, I'm curious. Drop a comment below and let me know what state or country you're watching from. Because I have a creeping suspicion this kind of entitlement, this HOA nightmare, is far more universal than we think. And I'd love to see where all of you are dealing with your own neighborhood dictators. My name is Kai Sullivan, but everyone just calls me Sully, and if you'd told me 8 months ago that I'd be living in a sleepy little cabin on the water, fighting off entitled suburbanites, I would have just laughed. 8 months ago, I was running a software company, a deep tech analytics operation that I'd built from nothing into something that sold for $50 million. Yeah, I heard that right. I was 35, completely burnt out from staring at screens 18 hours a day, managing something that only existed in cyberspace. I needed real. I wanted something I could touch, something that connected me to the physical world again. That's when I found this listing. A simple, rustic waterfront cabin, nothing fancy, listed for $950,000. Just a simple retreat property. But what truly snagged my attention wasn't the house itself. It was a tiny footnote buried deep in the property description about pre-existing maritime commercial rights and some old, dusty thing called a riparian covenant that came with the deed. Most people, they just gloss right over that legal jargon. But my brain, after years of dissecting complex M&A contracts, it was wired differently. I knew when something seems too technical to matter, that's usually when it matters most. So I met with the seller, an elderly woman named Mrs. Henderson, who was completely overwhelmed trying to settle her late husband Walter's estate. The cabin was modest, maybe 1,000 square feet, but it sat on prime waterfront real estate, with this long private pier stretching out into the bay. The real clue, the one that should have screamed commercial operation, was when Mrs. Henderson handed me this massive ring of keys, maybe 30 different keys of various sizes, and she just shrugged, saying, "These belong to Walter, darling." He was always down at the docks, but I never did figure out what they all opened. As we walked the property, the pieces didn't fit the simple retreat narrative. There were heavy-duty cleats for mooring huge vessels, industrial-grade electrical hookups, and fuel lines disappearing underground toward the water. Across the bay, commercial fishing boats were heading out. Luxury charters were preparing, and it was a constant, serious flow of maritime traffic. Walter, it turns out, had always just told his wife the water business was complicated and she should leave it to the men. I made an offer that afternoon. She accepted immediately, relieved to have the whole complicated mess off her hands. 3 weeks later, the moving truck left. I was standing on my new pier, just breathing in the salt air, feeling genuinely peaceful for the first time in years, when I saw them, 3 figures marching toward my property with that aggressive, purposeful stride that you just know means trouble. Cynthia Vance, mid-40s, dressed head to toe in expensive, maritime chic, but clearly more comfortable in a boardroom than a boat, stopped right at my property line and didn't bother with introductions. "I'm Cynthia Vance," she clipped, "president of the Crestview Shores Homeowners Association, and we need to discuss your immediate compliance with community maritime standards." Her tone, oh God, it was that condescending nails-on-a-chalkboard authority, like she was talking to a naughty child. I tried to be polite. "I'm Sully Sullivan, and this is my property. I just closed 3 weeks ago, so I'm not sure what standards you're referring to, but I'm happy to discuss any legitimate concerns." That just fueled her fire. "This primitive, unsightly fishing arrangement is completely incompatible with our community's vision for waterfront excellence," she sneered, gesturing dismissively at my modest 20-foot fishing boat and the perfectly functional, if aging, pier. The other woman, who was frantically taking pictures, chimed in. "The presence of commercial-grade implements creates an unsightly disruption to the carefully maintained ambiance our community has worked years to establish." Now, here's the thing that really confused me. During closing, My attorney had specifically confirmed this property was not subject to HOA covenants or restrictions. That's why I bought it. But before I could challenge her on jurisdiction, the nervous-looking man in his 60s started reading from a document. According to Section 4.7 of our community regulations, any waterfront owner engaged in commercial activities must obtain prior approval from the Architectural Review Committee. The whole thing felt surreal. I hadn't even unpacked, let alone engaged in commercial fishing, yet here they were, lecturing me on aesthetic guidelines I didn't think applied. I tried diplomacy again. Look, I think there's a massive misunderstanding here. I have no intention of running any kind of commercial business. This equipment is purely recreational. Cynthia's face shifted from condescension to pure open hostility. Personal recreation that disrupts community standards is still a violation of our neighborhood character preservation requirements. You have 72 hours to dismantle this pier and remove all equipment, or we will be forced to pursue legal remedies. The audacity of it all was stunning. I had just spent nearly $1 million, and this self-appointed tyrant was trying to dictate what I could do with my own private, non-HOA property. Just then, a deep horn blast echoed across the water, and I looked up to see a massive fishing trawler, probably 80 feet long, heading out to the ocean. The name on the hull read, "The Seeker," and as it passed my pier, the captain gave me this respectful, familiar wave. Cynthia, of course, seized on it. See? Exactly what I'm talking about. Your little hobby operation is encouraging this disruptive maritime traffic right through our residential area. These commercial vessels have no business operating so close to our luxury waterfront community. That's when I knew this wasn't about aesthetics. It was about territorial control and misplaced power. They were accustomed to getting their way through legal pressure, counting on people being too overwhelmed or financially constrained to fight back. But after years of navigating Byzantine crypto regulations and dealing with actual legitimate authorities, an HOA's empty threat carried zero weight with me. More importantly, I had the financial firepower and the curiosity to find out exactly what game they were playing. After they left, I immediately called my brother Finn, who practiced maritime law. "Sully," he chuckled. "That sounds like classic HOA overreach, but you need a full title search. Waterfront property in an active harbor. That's complex. You might have stumbled into more rights than you realize." He recommended a colleague, a sharp attorney named Sierra Vance, no relation to Cynthia, thankfully, who specialized in Pacific Northwest maritime disputes. The next morning, I spent my time talking to everyone at the harbor. That's when the pieces started clicking into place. "You're the new owner of the Henderson place," a charter boat captain said. "We've been wondering who was taking over the operation now that old Walter's gone." "The operation?" He looked at me confused. "Yeah, the Bayview Marina operations, the commercial licenses, the fuel concessions. Walter ran a pretty significant business out of that property for 30 years. I spent the rest of the morning realizing that the keys Mrs. Henderson gave me weren't random hardware. They were the keys to a thriving small maritime empire, one that I had accidentally inherited along with the cabin. If this was true, Cynthia's threats weren't just inappropriate. They were actively interfering with legitimate business operations that had been there for decades. Monday morning, 7:30 a.m., the phone rang. Caller ID blocked, but the voice was unmistakable. "Mr. Sullivan," Cynthia's voice crackled with false authority. "I'm calling to inform you we've decided to expedite our enforcement timeline due to additional violations we observed over the weekend. You now have 24 hours to begin dismantling your pier." When I asked what the new violations were, she smugly announced, "We have photographic evidence of you conducting unauthorized maritime business meetings throughout the weekend, clearly establishing commercial intent." She was talking about my conversations with the harbor workers, the very research I was doing to figure out my property. That's when I knew she was operating in pure bad faith, deliberately misinterpreting everything. I decided to push back. "Cynthia," I said, my voice calm, "I think you're wildly misunderstanding both my activities and your authority in this situation. I've done some research, and I am not convinced your HOA has any legitimate jurisdiction over my property. Before this goes any further, I think we should clarify exactly what legal authority you are claiming." The silence on the line was beautiful. When she finally responded, her confident tone was gone, replaced by thinly veiled rage. "Mr. Sullivan, you clearly don't understand how serious this situation is. I suggest you consult qualified legal counsel before you make a decision you'll regret." She hung up. That call crystallized my decision. No more negotiation. I needed to respond from a position of undeniable legal strength. I immediately called Sierra Vance, my lawyer, and emphasized the urgency. Sierra got to work on a comprehensive title and maritime rights search. By Wednesday afternoon, Sierra called me to her office. Her mahogany desk was covered in thick folders. "Sully," she said, her expression serious, "what I'm about to tell you is going to fundamentally change how you understand your entire purchase." She opened the first folder. "You didn't just buy a cabin and a pier. You bought the controlling interest in Bayview Maritime Operations, a commercial law marina business that's been operating continuously since 1975. Walter was essentially running a small maritime empire. 40 commercial boat slips, fuel concessions for the entire harbor, Coast Guard training agreements, the works. Mrs. Henderson unknowingly sold you a multi-million-dollar business for the price of a waterfront shack. But that wasn't the biggest bomb." Sierra pulled out a harbor map. "Now this is the current property survey. Your small cabin parcel is highlighted in red, but look at the sections highlighted in yellow." Her laser pointer swept over the entire residential development. The Crestview Shores residential community, where Cynthia lives and serves as HOA president, was built on acreage leased from Bayview Maritime Operations, your company, under a 99-year agreement signed in 1995. The implications were staggering. Cynthia wasn't just threatening me. She was threatening to disrupt business operations on land I technically owned. Every single house in her precious HOA existed because Walter Peaton had agreed to lease that waterfront acreage. And the irony? That lease agreement stipulated that the HOA paid annual fees to the Marina for waterfront access, fees that were collected through their monthly assessments. They had been paying my company for 30 years. Fast forward to Friday afternoon. Cynthia had called an emergency HOA meeting at the community center, promising definitive legal ammunition to resolve the commercial fishing problem. I decided to attend, not to defend myself, but to finally deliver the truth. Sierra was with me, armed with her presentation. The community center was packed. Cynthia, standing at the front with her nervous, high-priced downtown attorney, gave a dramatic, emotional presentation about how my reckless commercial activities were destroying their property values and the neighborhood's carefully cultivated ambiance. Her lawyer then delivered the supposed knockout punch, explaining the serious financial penalties for maritime violations. The crowd was clearly on her side, hostile glances aimed my way. Then Sierra stood up. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Sierra Vance, and I represent Mr. Sullivan. Before you vote on any legal action, I think you should understand exactly what situation you're dealing with and who you are actually threatening to sue." She unfolded the large harbor map and attached it to the easel. As the murmurs started, she continued, "The sections in red belong to Bayview Maritime Operations, Mr. Sullivan's company. The entire Crestview Shores residential community, highlighted in yellow, exists on land leased from Bayview Maritime Operations under a 1995 agreement." The room erupted. Cynthia's face went completely pale, and her attorney was frantically flipping through his notes. Sierra laid out the documentation, the commercial contracts, the Tuan Duyen agreements, the multi-million-dollar revenue stream, and then the final, brutal reveal. Mrs. Vance's interference with legitimate maritime commerce has already cost Mr. Sullivan's operation $87,000 in documented losses. Under federal law, this constitutes illegal restraint of trade, and the responsible parties, Mrs. Vance, can be held personally liable for all resulting financial harm. When Sierra revealed that Cynthia was facing over $200,000 in personal liability, and that her actions could give my company grounds to terminate the entire development lease, the mood in the room snapped. The anger was no longer directed at me. It was directed entirely at Cynthia. People were demanding her resignation and asking what they needed to do to repair the relationship with the Marina. I finally stood up and addressed the room, not as an adversary, but as their new landlord and business partner. I never intended to disrupt the partnership Walter built with this neighborhood. I want to continue that tradition, but Mrs. Vance's behavior was unacceptable, and there will be consequences for the damage she has caused to a local business that employs your neighbors and fuels your recreational boats. Sierra negotiated the settlement right there. Cynthia agreed to pay the $65,000 in documented damages and resigned immediately. Her attorney packed up his briefcase and bolted. 3 weeks later, Cynthia's house went up for sale with a reduced price. Standing on my dock that evening, watching my commercial vessels return from a successful run, I reflected on how that hostile confrontation had actually been the greatest catalyst in my life. I came here looking for peace, but instead, Cynthia's entitlement led me to discover the true value of what I'd purchased. Not just a cabin, but a thriving maritime business. Assets worth millions more than my entire crypto fortune, and a sense of belonging I never found in the digital world. The most satisfying thing? The woman who tried to tear down my pier never knew she was standing on land I owned, fighting a force far larger and more established than her petty territorial ambition. What do you think? Was this justice served? Did Cynthia deserve to lose her home after threatening mine? More importantly, is the idea of an HOA holding power over an entire neighborhood fundamentally flawed? Or was this just a case of one entitled person taking things too far? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you've ever had an HOA nightmare, share your story. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories where the entitled get a harsh dose of reality.